So up next, taking us forward is James. So we have James Coe. He's the Senior Policy Advisor at the University of Liverpool, where he works on issues of higher education and public policy. He's also today as part of his role at the People's Powerhouse on the Strategic Board, and I get the absolute delight and pleasure of working with him very often. As well as his professional roles, James is currently studying for a Master in Public Administration at the University of York. His interests lie in how public institutions can use their position to reduce local and regional socio-economic inequalities. That was a mouthful. In his presentation today, he's going to briefly touch on the impacts of higher education as a social leveller and the enhanced role he believes universities can play in the economic fortunes in the places they are based, and therefore providing greater opportunity for all. So yeah, really, really fascinating. I'm really excited to hear what James has to say. He's also told me if you want to tweet him, you can find him at James_Co1. So yeah, get tweeting as well, guys. Right, over to you, James.
Cheers, Steph. Thank you for that. I included the Twitter just to form a bit of a comparison with Andy's use of VHS and Betamax to get that in early on. So thank you for that. Cheers for having me, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm just going to share my screen so I get the presentation up I'm going to talk to. So thanks very much for the introduction, Steph. That was really generous. And as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I think as I was looking through Twitter yesterday and seeing all the discussions you've been having, it was really apparent to me that this was not only an overdue conversation, but one that's absolutely vital in the way we conceptualise working class cultures and the way it impacts on universities. I could not agree more with that sentiment which someone expressed yesterday, that identifies working class as more than the way we cut our sandwiches. I thought it was an absolutely wonderful motif and a way to think about it. Today, I suppose, what I'm going to talk about is not only my experience as a working class student in higher education, but the ways in which I think universities can address wider social inequalities. And like Andy was saying, I suppose I find myself approaching this topic from a bit of a mixed point of view. I feel like I have a somewhat conflicted identity, as I've seen many of you reflect in the chat. I identify as being profoundly working class. It is something which I culturally identify with, but also something from my family background. But equally, I find that I almost experience this working class identity as an outsider looking in. It feels like something which has informed my past and who I am today. But as to how much this is an ongoing and effective identity, I'm less sure. I'm sure, like many of you, I find myself therefore at a crossroads, thinking deeply how my working class identity impacts everything I do, while simultaneously wondering, am I turning into a class imposter? Or indeed, am I thinking too much about it? Or what does it even mean to be working class? So I want to start off by saying there is clearly no homogenous working class identity. In an attempt to do so, we either over-romanticize it or we underplay it. Even worse, we've missed the multiple identities that go into being working class, or we miss some vital comparison. But what I think is really important to draw out is that I believe I only became firmly aware of my working class identity at the point I went into university. It was only the point I received a bursary for good A-levels and my economic background, where something occurred to me saying that being clever and not very well off is actually a unique marker. Until then, I'd grown up in sunny Darlington in the northeast. My friends were like me, my teachers were like me, my history teacher had come from a pea shelling factory through adult education to teaching us our A-levels. It was a very, very deeply working class experience. My cultural outlook was informed by this as well. For 19 weekends a year, my dad would make me suffer by going to watch Newcastle with his work friends, a working class experience again and again. And it was only when, I think very late to my university experience, after I'd received my bursary, I said earlier, I found myself in my literature class, reading Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night, Sunday Morning. And I suddenly felt a real sense of dissonance. To be reading a firmly working class text, up until on that point, it had been a profoundly middle class experience. And I must be honest that in my university, I feel really privileged. I went to the University of Liverpool as a student, and I enjoyed it so much I continue to go there now. But my question is, if I feel like that on an individual level, what are the wider social indicators, and what systematically could universities do to think of wider social inequalities? So today I'm going to touch on three things. What does the rising tide look like in entry into higher education? I won't touch on class at first, but looking at wider social inequalities as a means to think is university the great leveller. Then, as Andy said in his talk, to look at the ongoing debate between what is higher education for and who is benefiting from it. And then finally, I want to touch on how I believe universities can be a magnet institution that draws benefits to their region and improve the lot of the people who live there. And I think sometimes we can get caught up with universities as institutions, but I want to start off with my profound belief that a more equal education system is good for society as a whole. Education progress, class progress, and equality are intimately linked, as Wilkinson and Pickett showed in The Spirit Level. And there is a narrative. You remember very clearly Tony Blair's "We want 50% of people in higher education." And in part this has happened, but who it has happened for is equally important. The data in front of you shows higher education based on polar quintile. For those who aren't aware, polar data is an amalgamation of postcode data based on participation in higher education. And what we have found is that although there is increased participation in higher education across all of these groups, it has not moved between groups in a dramatic way. This means that we may be closing gaps overall, but relatively, gaps still remain. And fair enough, you may say to me, okay, if lower postcode data has lower entry in higher education, well, then that's somewhere inevitability. However, if we look at other measurements, including MEM, which is the multiple equality measure, which takes in a range of factors from students, including their socioeconomic background, ethnicity, and indices of multiple deprivation, we find that the more granularly we look into a student's socioeconomic status, the less likely they are to attend higher education, with high ratios existing between the two. Or even if we take the crudest measure of students who receive free school meals and those who do not, as a measure of entry into higher education, we again find that the gaps are not closing at a particularly quick rate. Having closed relatively entry rates by 0.6% in 13 years, we are looking at something like another 120 years before we close that rate completely. And I just want to pause on this, and I think it's important we don't conflate working class identities with wider socio-economic inequalities. But one of the things I firmly believe is centred within my working class identity is a belief in equality of opportunity, and a belief that actually going to university was an opportunity to get on. It was somewhat unusual in the part of the town I grew up in, but it was something which was drummed into me as an early age. Another couple of things which I think are interesting. In order to make that ambition a reality, it requires specific fiscal interventions. Postgraduate education rates only equalised and then took over for the students who are in the lowest participation postcodes on the introduction of postgraduate loans. It took an immense financial change. What we still find, however, is even if you get in and even if you get on, there is a change between highly skilled work and degree classifications. Roughly speaking, if I get a first class degree, I have a reasonable chance of what's classified as highly skilled work. However, if I get a lower second or a third, I'm disproportionately punished, if you will, based on the background. And I say this to highlight that disparities exist, but I should put this into the frame that I believe universities can be a profoundly transformative experience. And this depends how you look at it. Earnings are significantly higher for graduates than for non-graduates, and students from Russell Group institutions, not counting the wider inequalities that exist there, and in attendance in particular, are higher than for non-Russell Group graduates. As we said before, entry into there is the key for me. So we find ourselves in a situation where universities can have transformative impacts on attainment, entry, qualification, and life chance. However, if we do not equalise that for all, then what is the benefit? And it's really important to say that most people think likewise. The Millennium Cohort study found that no less than 97% of mothers wanted their children to go on to university. This was true across class, and even those who had not attended university themselves, 96% of this cohort wanted their children to go. It is a nationwide ambition that we should go to university. The question is, how can we use the university itself as an institution and its position to bring greater equality of opportunity for all? In their work, Social Mobility and Its Enemies, Lee Elliott Major and Steve Mechin looked at what are some of the barriers that I've addressed. And they come back with three. An emphasis on earnings within higher education leads to questions of programs and their value based on income. Secondly, that despite the expansion of HE, the graduate gap between the most privileged and least privileged on entering HE has widened. And finally, although the entry gap has narrowed, it has not done so at the most prestigious university. The most optimistic view which I present of universities is that people get in and has transformative impact on their life. The most negative view is that we are living within a polarised system where working class students are routinely disadvantaged from taking part. And then to move away from social inequalities more generally, and pick up Andy's point looking particularly at working class experiences, we are part of an ongoing debate that seems to have been going on almost forever about are simply too many people going to university. And there are two things we should be absolutely clear about. The target of 50% going to people in university never existed. It was 50% of people going to higher education. And I believe that distinction is important because we talk less of the types of education we have and put it in the whole. What I think is really important is that we look at the nature of provision as a means of breaking down class boundaries, as has been discussed in the chat. Secondly, if we are saying not 50% of people need to go to university, then you need to decide who that is and what they do instead. If we are saying, I think higher education is important, then that's fine across the piece. If we are saying higher education is important for my children, then that's a very different debate. And I sometimes worry we go down that route. And finally, we should not pit higher education and further education against each other. I think higher education has a transformative role in the place they are based, but further education is incredible for skills development, pathways, and being transformative qualifications in and of themselves. I don't have a position that I think more education is a bad thing. And I think as working class academics and people interested in this space, we should defend that as a concept. So on to my final 2 points. What can universities do directly for working class students? I think the first trench of activity is that there is direct activity universities undertake in order to support entry. This can be financial support, in the example I gave earlier of my bursary, information, advice and guidance. So in part, this is the formal outreach activity universities do. But I think there's a powerful role for peer mentoring to hear from other working class students about their experiences and how they can get on. Thirdly, there's mentoring, which universities put in place alongside student support, and summer schools to expose students to activities on campus. I think all this is excellent, but I want to finish on the point that alone, this will not be enough to close the gaps. And instead, in order to bring true equality, and indeed to bring a working class lens and to engage with our working class communities properly, we need to conceive universities not as anchors in some way holding down the place they are based, but magnets who have a unique power to attract different outlooks and perspectives to their institutions. And I think we can do this in 5 ways. So firstly, in research and development. Of course, where research is published and who it is published by and its quality are always going to be strong academic factors. However, recent research has looked at where we can choose to invest to reduce wider social inequalities. This does not necessarily advocate investing at the cutting edge, but investing in a broad base. This may be where there are large numbers of employers. As part of their civic engagement, I'd be interested to see the universities that consider how their research investment and where they choose to spend can support local supply chains and the local jobs market, as well as bring expertise into their local area. I think the second area where universities could explore is that they are profoundly cultural institutions. We produce cultures through our galleries, museums, but who are those cultures? Who is producing them? And how can we give a greater platform to working class cultures through our output? At the moment, the University of Liverpool is running a website called Culture at Home, which is designed to connect people during COVID. It has an explicit intention to think about different cultures. Thirdly, in employment and skills, there is distinct gaps between students based on their socio-economic status and what they achieve. I think it would be appropriate for universities to consider explicit programs that target students who enter university without the same levels of cultural capital. This should not be patronising, and it should not be seen as an outreach or doing a favour, but something which is built with the needs of those students in mind. And the last two I'd like to touch on is that universities have huge financial clout. They can procure a lot of things. In the wake of the financial crash, in the way that Preston Council remodelled their work to buy local and support their local communities, I think there's a role for universities to do likewise. And I think finally, crucially, and the most intangibly, the cultures which we replicate on campus are important. It is incumbent on all of us to not only be proudly working class, to encourage the people after us, but to think how we encourage more working class cultures on our campus in whatever form they take. So to finish off, I think universities can be transformative. I think there's work for us to do in order to encourage access. And I think thinking of our wider working class experiences, there's a role for us all to push our institutions to address wider inequalities on our doorsteps. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, James. And there's been a lot of love for your co-presenter, Jarvis, who's been making an appearance in the chat. Oh, there we go. We get to see him in all his glory. So just before we move on, I know we're not doing questions now, but somebody asked in the chat, what was the book that you were reading at university when you had your kind of working class epiphany?
Oh, sorry. Saturday Night, Sunday Morning by Alan Sillitoe.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks so much, James. That was absolutely brilliant. And I think everybody loves a graph, and we got a lot of graphs. I say it's never too early for a graph. And also, I'm really interested in exploring kind of what universities' place is in the places that they're in. And I think that, you know, that conversation being moved towards our universities understanding that they are based in communities and therefore have a responsibility to the communities that they're based in is something that's hugely fascinating to me, and beyond just kind of economic transactions, but also cultural and social transactions, I think is something that is hugely fascinating, and I often talk about myself. So thanks very much for that, James. So